Ready?
Okay.
Welcome back, everyone. I'm Ginetta Candelario, editor of Meridians, Feminism, Race, Transnationalism, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to our Founders Panel, our first full session of our 20th anniversary celebration. Joining us for the Founders Panel today are President Ruth Simmons, who gave us our keynote welcoming address, and Professor Nancy Supporter Sternback, and Professor Susan Van Dyne. Susan Van Dyne and Nancy Sternback are going to walk us through the history of the journal and how they came to conceive of this amazing project and to shepherd it for its first decade and more at Smith. So my first question, the bios, by the way, for Professor Sternback and Susan Van Dyne and for all our participants today are available on the Crowdcast website and on our program, which is right here. So we want to go through that right now. Susan and Nancy, could you please walk us through how you came to think of the journal and what inspired you and the steps that you took to make Meridians happen? Welcome and thank you.
Thank you, Ginetta. And thank you to all of the editors who took our bold beginnings forward. We all began by Ruth's bold, radical charge that she gave us. She said she wanted a journal by, for, and about women of color. And those were meaningful terms. By letting women of color speak for themselves, not be spoken for by others, to have a voice that carried, to have a journal that belonged to them. But for was equally important. Ruth intended to change the character of the Academy. She radically wanted to change who succeeded for tenure. So for women of color meant that we had their back. We wanted to make certain that those people advanced through those difficult days where their work was discredited by offering a refereed place to have their work published. And then about women of color, Ruth accurately predicted, as others have quoted, that she knew that this work about women of color and their concerns would be at the top of the academic agenda in the future. And it has been. It was already in progress for the first 20 years before we came on the scene, but it has become even more central to the education of every undergraduate. I want to begin, though, with a call out to our collective. We worked as a collective. It was crucial. It was cross-racial. It was deeply, deeply collaborative. But let me say all 7 names, 4 of whom identified as women of color: Ravina Agarwal, Anne Arnett Ferguson, Anne Rosalind Jones, Elizabeth Alexander, who now heads the Mellon Foundation. How much of a transformative effect has she had on the content and the viability of higher education, especially at institutions like Smith, small liberal arts ones? And Rosalind Jones, I hope I've said already, and Gail Pemberton, who brought us our first publisher. Her cross-institutional support for us at Wesleyan allowed us to publish the first 2 volumes. Gail's influence can't be underestimated. So I was in touch, of course, with Anne and Elizabeth and Gail to make certain that their voices were heard in this conversation. So at various key points, I'm going to turn to my script and read what they had to say. But first, I want to just say about Anne. She's celebrating her own kind of 20th anniversary. Her book, Bad Boys, has just been reissued by the University of Michigan Press 20 years after its first publication, testifying to the importance of that book to 2 decades of scholars. And as I said, Elizabeth took time to talk to me in the middle of unbelievable workload at the Mellon Foundation. And we're all so grateful for the work she has done in transforming the world of liberal arts through her support in the Mellon Foundation. But it was Ruth's leadership that influenced us all. Let me read you what Elizabeth had to say. When I spoke at the dinner for my honorary degree at Smith, I talked about how both with Meridians and the Poetry Center, that to be able to do this work without huge bureaucratic impediment, because we were at a women's college and led by visionary president, our beloved Ruth, was exceptional. I've never had that experience since in any other institution where I worked. I was able to work forward with efficiency and support I was able to work forward with a clear charge. So Nancy, how did we figure out what our name was going to be?
Well, we danced around it. We met weekly, by the way, and sometimes more than once a week. It was a huge time commitment and emotional and intellectual commitment. But we talked about different names. I think, if I'm not mistaken, that even some of these subcategories that ended up being in the journal may have been drafts of names like counterpoints and hemispheres and all those kinds of in the trenches. And it just didn't ring true. And then one day Anne came in and she said, I was consulting the dictionary and I like the word meridians because meridians is both a physical thing, a line that goes through the body, but it also expresses geography. And if there's anything that this journal does, it goes through various geographies of the world. Because one of the issues that we had grappled with was this going to be a journal about women of color in the US, or was it going to be women of color in the world? And once we realized that women especially move back and forth, and you can't actually pinpoint them geographically, that they are transnational. Once we realized that Meridians was such a perfect way to describe that movement and migration of women across countries, across geographies, across different kinds of boundaries, both intellectual and emotional and political, of course. And so when we heard it, we all kind of jumped for joy. It was a recognition that this was who we had to be. And we voted, of course, because we did everything that way. But it was like hallelujah. It was hurrah. It was a moment of pure recognition that this is how the name had to come about. So that's my memory of where we got it from.
Good. You know, the what happens after the colon has been a stumper for many people. Like, what did we mean? Feminism, race, transnationalism. That each and every one of those words is itself contested. They interpenetrate. They contextualize each other. They are not easy terms. And so we spent a lot of time asking each other and asking our advisory board. As Ruth said, it was a fantastic advisory board. We even set them up in our first issue to talk about what those terms meant in their own life and work as scholars, activists, as writers, as poets, as theorists. And what we got back was incredible. So that those the women who were busy met them, we asked them to be on the advisory board, came to our aid. They suffused us with their own expertise. They adopted us really, and mentored us in those early days, and helped us see exactly how complicated feminism, race, and transnationalism were. And transnationalism was really important to us, a new word to me as we were working through it on the collective, different from internationalism because it was meant to resist economic globalization. So transnationalism, as Amrita Basu said, depended on new technologies to be able to form movements across national borders, but it also needed to be situated as resistant to economic globalization. So I'm so glad that those terms persisted, that nobody had the idea that they were completely unintelligible, because I think they have gained meaning. Their intersections have gained meaning with every single volume we publish. What do you think, Ruth? Does it still work for you?
Definitely. Yes. You did a masterpiece.
I think in those days also that you had to whisper that you were a feminist, and so declaring it so boldly on the title of the journal was really a big step forward, and it was a rethinking of the academy, as Ruth said earlier. It cost some of us a lot in our own departments who were not as forward thinking as we would have liked them to be able to say that we were working on a journal about women of color and feminism. Because famously, my first week at Smith, I went to a 5 college women's studies conference, and the very famous international speaker declared that Latin American women did not consider themselves feminists. And I realized that we have a lot of work to do here. That if a woman of color who's an international figure thinks that, what must the rest of the world think? And so that sort of determined my path at Smith, was to show that Latin American women did indeed consider themselves feminists, and I had a lot of proof for it as well. And so I just feel that's naming was as the most important figure of how we were going to organize our scholarship was crucially important in that.
Right. And I remember I said something like that feminism didn't mean what it means to us as Western women, that all of our advisory board was very careful to contextualize all 3 terms in their own social location, and how social location changed understandings of those words and their interrelationships. So it found in our early collective experience enormous resonance. I wanted to just talk about how being a collective shaped our process. And collective was very challenging, collaborative, difficult at times. As Nancy said, we met more than any other group on campus, I think. And Ann Ferguson said it helped that we met in each other's kitchens. She said the work went better when we met in each other's kitchens, because we weren't going to get interrupted or booted out of a room that we hadn't reserved for long enough. So we had those uninterrupted conversations as a collective. And then we took retreats. So the most memorable for all of us was, remember the time we got snowed in Vermont for 3 days? We didn't have partners. We had nothing. We didn't have children. We just had each other to go at this work. And we did. And I think that Anne is right, that our venues were what helped us make such difficult decisions, such durable decisions, and have the confidence in the work. So always think it's location, location, location.
Well, I think also the idea of collective probably came out of some of the early work of second wave feminism, where everybody said they were a collective, but we decided we were going to be a new kind of collective. And we really did not want a hierarchy in our group. We wanted everybody to have a democratic voice, of course, and we wanted it not to be one person's project, that the other people were their little sergeants, their little go-tos. So we worked very hard, and I would say that the overlying emotion that we felt was respect for each other and each other's opinions. We all came to the table from a vast array of intellectual, academic, social, racial backgrounds, and we wanted to bring our knowledge. What we had in common was that the expression that we used was we were doing the work. And the work was the work of feminism, of women of color. That's the work that we were doing, and that's what we had in common, and that's what we brought to the table. And just as Susan said, that feminism may not mean the same thing in Africa as it did in Latin America, there was still that overlying and overarching kind of principle that this was the important thing to do, and that it encompassed the majority of the world. Since women are the majority and women of color are the majority, that we were not talking about a small group of people. And once we made that realization, it opened us up to a bigger kind of thinking. It was a radical moment for all of us when we realized that this was really all the women in the world except for a few white women. So that was a life-changing moment, I felt.
Mm-hmm. And our premises was that we wanted to publish work that was itself interdisciplinary. Not only were our academic locations in different disciplines, but we believed that interdisciplinarity was the key to the kind of work that would expand the accessibility of these insights and that would have relevance to more than one field. And I know you had something more to say about interdisciplinarity, Nancy.
Well, yeah, there wasn't there, the college and all academic institutions were so divided by disciplinarity. And so, as Ruth was talking earlier about tenure review panels, not knowing how to evaluate interdisciplinary work. And we realized that the work that we did had to be interdisciplinary because it was the only way to bring together all the aspects of the kind of outpouring that we were seeing. That it was the only thing that made sense. That activism went with scholarship, that poetry went with scholarship, that research went with archives, and there was not a place to put that. And so that really was the motor of our interdisciplinarity. But at the time, it was like you couldn't say you were a feminist and you couldn't say that your work was interdisciplinary, and yet this journal was doing all of those things at the same time.
Right. And Elizabeth reminds us, as we knew at the time, that for women of color, often doing creative work, poetry could be a vehicle for theory, so that those lines themselves in the work that we were looking at were intentionally crossed, intentionally expanded. So I think that all of the categories that we placed work in were intentionally expansive and productive. For instance, Counterpoints was one of our first ways to be in touch with to publish our advisory board's comments on our terms. So Counterpoints were these staged conversations to talk about what was contested, to talk about what was debated, to insist on the relevance of being in different social locations. And as you said,
I think one of the things that happened also was that the way those categories got named was our own experience in our scholarship and in our teaching, where we had those counterpoints in the classroom when we were trying to teach this material, where we had those stumbling blocks when we were trying to publish this material, where we had those obstacles when we were trying to get promoted from one rank to another. All of those things happened, and they happened because of the work that we were doing, that it was work that nobody knew how to evaluate. And so we wanted to make this a public recognition that it wasn't just one person alone in her cubicle that had this, that it was a phenomenon. And Ruth had the good sense and vision to recognize that early on, and to say that there's once that happened, the outpouring, the level of submissions that we received was overpowering. We couldn't find enough readers to review the work because it came in boatloads. We really couldn't believe that this was this gap that was getting filled by all of this scholarship that did not have a home up until that moment. It gave us goosebumps. It really was so exhilarating to see that this idea created this space, and this space was so needed.
Right. And that was certainly one of the things that our bigger advisory board helped us with. They read manuscripts, they read submissions. They were more active than most boards are in a lifetime. They really pitched in. They mentored us. They read submissions. They had context for more essays and articles. It was really, really gratifying. I just want to say about In the Trenches, which is one of our persistent, enduring categories, that activism is one of the parts of feminist work that most often gets lost or forgotten. We're in the streets and then we're forgotten, right? Before the digital age and the iPhone. And so it was really important for us to preserve activism, again, as a form of feminist theorizing, but as footsteps that we needed to travel again, and that we needed to put it on paper so that people didn't have to keep inventing protest movements, so that they could see what other people had done. So what was difficult at the time in gaining the support of maybe our departments or our people at Smith, and Ruth told us how difficult this entire moment was. I'd have amnesia about that, which is good, but that it lasts. It's durable. One of the most, I asked all of us on the collective what was their most rewarding or fondest memory. And for me, it was holding that first issue in my hand. It was slick. It was beautiful, that dark red. It had heft. And I felt we were just entering the new millennium, and I had it on paper. It was incredibly moving. Yes.
Yeah, and the other thing about In the Trenches was that it gave a space. It wasn't just that other people had done the work and you didn't have to redo it. It gave an acknowledgement to the fact that you could be a feminist and be an activist and not necessarily a scholar. And we honored that because we thought that that was important work also. We wanted to find a place for it. Some of the other categories that we thought about were the creative ones, which had not really existed in journals up until that point, where we created poetry. We didn't create the poetry, we created a space for the poetry, where photography, where other forms of expression could find a home. And these were all part of the bigger picture. These were stumbling blocks that so many women that we knew had come across in trying to get their work recognized. And it created a prestigious home, not just a home, but a prestigious home, because, as Ruth said earlier, and Elizabeth also said, it was a refereed journal. It wasn't somebody's basement, which I honor and love those journals. But when we're talking about academic, it was a refereed journal, and all those contributions were peer reviewed.
When I want to make certain that I give voice to the people who responded to me from the collective, and Gail Pemberton said how important it was, how grateful she feels now to have been there at the naissance of the Meridians journal. And she said she hoped that what she brought, the Wesleyan connection, the Wesleyan University Press, would be sustaining to us. And it was. If we hadn't had that anchor for us, that guarantee that we would last at least 2 years, we wouldn't have thrived. We wouldn't have been able to carry on the work before we found Duke. And so Gail's connection, her sense of humor were invaluable to us. And she taught me patience. I'm a volatile kind of girl, and Gail taught me patience.
Well, laughing right now makes me remember that was the thing that we gave each other, was a lot of laughter. And that really helped in the harder times because the commitment was so strong in terms of time that it took away a lot of other moments. And we sustained each other through that time by humor. And I just want to say that for me is a very enduring memory.
Yes. So I want to end with something from Elizabeth, who speaks for all of us. She says, planning today's conversation brought me back to our founding moments and the extraordinary power of our collective work. I remain so proud of what we did together and gratified that the work and legacy have been carried forward beautifully for these 20 years. Thank you, Elizabeth, and all of the collective, all 7 members of the collective. So that's our history.
And I just want to say that for me, what my most enduring memory is that it's one of the highlights of my 34 years at Smith. It's the highlight of my 34 years at Smith. So that's what endures.
Yeah. So thank you, Ruth, for getting us started, for that wonderful charge that proved so lightning for those of us in the collective.
It's beautiful what's happened, and but not just what has happened, but what it teaches us about what we can do. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan and Nancy, for that wonderful conversation and historicization of the journal, how you did the work, how it came to be, and for naming and reminding us of the folks who couldn't join us today. I'm sorry that we weren't able to have them, but we really appreciate your bringing them forward and telling us about what they did. I want to also note, which I haven't mentioned in this forum yet, that I was a brand new faculty member at Smith. I want to say, I put in the chat, Nancy was my professor at Smith. So I met her when I was 17 years old, and I am especially grateful to her presence at Smith and all the work that she did as a faculty member, and the way that she welcomed me as a colleague in Latin American and Latino studies, which she helped to found. So it touches my heart in a special way to be able to share this particular conversation with you, Nancy. Who knew, right, that we'd be here together?
I never guessed when we were sitting in my classroom that we would be here today, I have to say.
Smith did wonders for me. And I hope I was with that by doing wonders for it. But I was a new faculty member at Smith in 1999, and was one of those folks who had the honor and the privilege of submitting my work to that large pile of submissions. And so volume 1, number 1, features an essay that was a piece of the dissertation that I was still working on at that time on Dominican racial identity and the central role of hair and hair culture. So it was actually my very first peer-reviewed article was published in Meridians. So I can personally attest to the difference it made for my own scholarly trajectory and my own thinking, and having this community of intersectional, feminist, anti-racist, transnational scholars. And also that I was invited to join subsequently the Smith Editorial Advisory Board. And that was really such a deep honor. I wonder if you could say a little bit or remember the meetings that we had on campus where we brought together Ama Ata and Angela Davis and Kum Kum and so many others. I mean, I know the editors group will be talking about that on Saturday, because I'll ask them to tell us about the work that they did during the editorship. But for folks who are here today and may not be here on Saturday, could you just tell us about the work that happened subsequently? And Ruth, I'm curious, you've listened to this history as well, and I know that you were in College Hall and often having to be away from campus while we were doing this work, but your presence was such a part of that as well. So could you just talk us through that kind of gathering together that happened also in those years of the journal? And bringing these international scholars, these nationally renowned folks to come to the table, to the seminar table, and to our spaces on campus?
Well, you know, I was not able to participate in meetings so much, but when I'm reading these names, I'm recalling how important it was. Our project was not simply to give a place for this important work, but also to give a place for these scholars. And it thrills me to recall these unique individuals whom we were privileged to have around us. And as I think back on my career, which is very long, the thing that I think about, frankly, is how greatly influenced I have been by wonderful people who brought insights that I needed to have, who challenged us in very unique ways, who had incredible spirits. And I suppose that's normal, given the kind of activism and the way in which so many of them were breaking through in unique ways. I suppose it's no surprise that they were so unique. But you know, spending time with them for me was an enormous benefit. One of the things I know you all have experienced is that they say that leadership is lonely. And I suppose in some ways I would support that. But on the other hand, the nature of our work was such, as you just heard from Nancy and Susan, that we had a collective of people who got it, who understood what was at risk if we did not do our part. And so all of these individuals who came together to do this work, knowing that they had other things that they could do, and yet they chose to do this because they recognized the importance of it. That was what was so inspiring for me. And frankly, I don't think for a minute that I could have done the work that I did without all of them teaching me how, by their courage, by their independence, by their innovative thinking, and so forth. And sometimes, sometimes I think after I got to Brown and I found myself enmeshed in this slavery study, people kept asking, some of the people said, "Are you crazy?" Some people said, "You must have lost. You must have lost it because you can't possibly think this is going to have a good outcome for you." But in some ways, I had become insulated from those kinds of observations. I'll call them observations, because I learned in the work we did at Smith that there were some things that we could do that could not be judged near term, and that we need not worry about the skeptics and about the criticisms, because the story would be told over time of whether what we did had merit. That's one point. And the other point is, I believe at the heart of what we do, given the history of Smith, and given what we knew to be the case with formerly disenfranchised groups, that the day comes when those injustices must be overturned. And to participate in that work, and to learn how others have done it and how others have contributed, is something that enables the work that must go on to overturn other injustices that arise. So it's so that's what I was thinking about as I was interacting with these extraordinary women, is that they were doing this work in a pivotal moment. I knew it was going to change the academy. I mean, when from the time that I was at Princeton trying to convince the math department there that there was a mathematician who was a woman who could be appointed to the faculty in math, in spite of the fact that there wasn't a single women's restroom in the entire math building. They insisted that could not happen because there was no woman who was a good enough mathematician to hold appointment in that department. So I think back to the moments when that was so pervasive in fields, to the moment where we are today, and to be able to appreciate that journey and to understand that it didn't happen with people gracefully coming into full knowledge of the error of that. It didn't happen that way at all. It happened by dint of people doing the kinds of things that people did with Meridians. That's how it happened. And that's what we're teaching our students, that this is what you have to do if you want to build a better world. But it was a wonderful, exciting time to know these extraordinary women. I remember when I brought Paula Giddings to Smith, and I'm trying to remember, Paula, if you're hearing this, whether or not that was a difficult recruitment or not. But in any case, Paula was so well established. She had been on the faculty of Duke. She'd been on the faculty at Princeton for a time. And still, although we had women doing the kind of work that Paula did, and today she's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and so on. It was still at that moment that people would say, "Well, but you don't fit the pattern." Just as Toni Morrison didn't fit the pattern. SUNY Albany. Oh, I don't know. I mean, how will we announce that we appointed somebody from SUNY Albany? That's how ridiculous much of what we do in the academy actually is. Overturning that decisively seemed to me to be what Smith um, is all about, because it had to overturn the notion that women were unsuitable for high intellectual attainment, right? And so to continue that work forward, and in my current role at an HBCU, I think of it the same way. I think of the history of pushing forward and trying to overcome the discrimination and bias that so many of the ancestors of our students had to overcome, and how truly unworthy we would be today if we didn't take up that cause and continue that work. So Meridians is all about revealing what is possible, and then urging people to carry the work forward. So that, to me, it doesn't get any better than that, really. I've been sitting here listening to Nancy and Susan, and being frankly quite near tears listening to them recount those days, and I am so incredibly moved by the fact that what we thought of as I think a small effort, but a worthy one, could grow into something like this, simply because intelligent people with immense heart and passion and generosity committed themselves to doing this work. It's a simple story, isn't it? But it's so powerful, and that's the way things happen. And I worry about where we are in this country now. We thought we'd solve the problem of the denigration of women and the enslavement of people and the violence against groups. We thought that was solved, and it's not. Mm. And so here we are, back in the fight, trying to make sure that the lesson of Meridian's creation and its success teaches people that this is work that can be done if we would but persist.
Can I tell a tiny anecdote about the first time I met our advisory board? So we invited them to town, and they came, like 20 of them from our advisory board, from all over the place. And so we had the opening reception in the Sophia Smith collection in the library. They came into the reception and lit up the room. But there we were in the repository of history with these women who had made history. They were part of our intellectual genealogy, and they began to have a great time. We weren't allowed to bring food or wine into the library at that time, but we did for that reception. And they were dressed to the nines. They were gorgeous people. So we had this wonderful time just immersed in the history of the Sophia Smith collection. The next day, they came to work with us for an entire day, a Saturday, as I recall, and they gave us such good advice. They had things to say. They were completely engaged in the project. We were so early on, and they believed in us. So that was really inspiring to us. And as I said, they were featured in our very first issue in Counterpoints. And Anne Ferguson remembers that for Counterpoints, she met and interviewed Nawal El-Sadawi and Ama Ata Aidu, both of them activists and authors. She said, it was wonderful to talk about feminism with two women whom I admired so much. I had used Aidu's books in my classes, and Nawal's autobiography was something I had read and reread. It was the brightest moment of my encounter with Meridians. So those moments traced our beginnings and our continued inspiration. It was really, really important to us to have them with us.
I'm glad you mentioned Nawal, Susan, because as you know, she passed recently, and it reminded me of having had the privilege and the honor of meeting her precisely during that gathering that you organized. I was ever so grateful that I got to be in her presence and hear her story in person because of Meridians. So may she rest in peace and be looking down at us and proud of what we're doing.
And we can have a bit in the next Meridians about her passing. Her work.
Well, actually, our next issue that's coming out this fall is an issue that's focusing on feminist responses to global Islamophobia. And we are sure that it will do honor to her own work in Egypt and with Meridians. So thank you. We do have a question from the audience. I'm going to go ahead and ask that. Let's see, I'm going to pop it up here. One of our contributors to the reader and panelist, tomorrow I think it is, so surely Deb, asks the question: how did collectives focused on women of color help in rehabilitating, for want of a better word, women of color whose tenures were denied? What kind of collectives can we form now in restoring economic justice to women of color whose tenures are being denied still today for doing the kind of work they are doing or for being who they are?
I think that one's for you, Ruth.
Well, one of the things that I spent quite a lot of time with different universities encouraging new approaches to hiring. And it goes something like this. One of the greatest assets of scholars and universities is the capacity, the intellectual ability to assess quality of work and talent. What prevents our being able to do that well, in some cases, is the biases that impede our ability to see beyond what is familiar to us and perhaps what is desirable to us, to what can really be enlightening beyond anything that we currently know. And so what I do is encourage departments and, first of all, administrations to work with departments to look at people in a new way. And then I have a whole list of examples of where universities have been absolutely wrong in making those decisions. And I think you have to use that evidence to make sure that people will, in fact, get it. And so that's one thing. The other thing is I encourage them to look for those individuals who have been denied tenure and do the work of assessing their work. First of all, read their work, and examine them.
Right.
So often they don't do that. And so one of the frustrations with the appointment of Toni Morrison is people are making these judgments who've not read her work. And there's, how can we have any patience with scholars who understand and value scholarship, but are unwilling to do the hard work of looking at people's work? And so over time, I've had, I would say, a fair degree of success in bringing people into the academy who did not fit somewhere else. And I've often had the interest in creating a whole project around this very thing. Now, I'm often contacted by scholars who didn't make it and ask, what can I do to get on track, and so forth. And so the other thing that we can do is we can mentor these scholars, because there are obviously specific things that they can do in order to address some of the perceived deficits that they have, and that work is well worth doing, because I know scholars who are very visible and successful who've been through that experience, but who got a second chance at it because somebody was willing to say, what so often their peers in the field would never say to them. And that is, this is what you need to do to be successful, and to have your peers judge you in the proper light, because once you get to a certain point, you have the control.
Mm.
You can then focus on areas of importance to you and build your career. But right now, here's what you can do in order to make sure that you have the security that you need as a scholar to be independent. I mean, one of the things that I think is, you all know, when with tenure, that that is most gratifying is that, you know, you get to the place where you don't have to worry about what people think. You know, that actually happens eventually. And one of the things that I've discovered is that now that I'm at that point in my life, it's very hard for people to manage me, because of course I could care less what they think. And so I say what I want and I do what I want, and everybody could reach that point at some juncture, because that's when you can do your best work. Because if you really have good ideas, and if you have something to say, then that's what you fight for. You fight for the ability to get to the point where you can be fully powerful in your work. And so that you know, whether I will ever get to the point where I can build a project around that, maybe this is something to talk to Elizabeth about. But I think it would be a very worthy project to find ways to invite those scholars in, and to do what we do all the time for people who are aspiring to do certain things. They should not be lost to the academy. And when I was coming along, unfortunately, there were lots of people who just didn't make it, and who were never able to come back into the academy. And we don't have so many people with the kind of talent that we need, that we can afford to lose so many people.
One of the things we need to do, we need to work on the other end too, that generation of people who don't understand that work. So I was involved for about a decade, educating faculty at all sorts of institutions and high schools about the importance and significance of work on women of color and gender. And one of the things we found out was that not knowing that work made people very, very anxious. And once they get anxious, they just shut down. So you need to help faculty who are already tenured, who are making those decisions, to re-educate themselves, because even if they did read the words along the page, they wouldn't understand it. So, and they would be anxious about not understanding it. So that consulting work that I did now a long time ago, but it reminded me how anxious even senior faculty can be about their shortcomings, what they don't know. And so I spent a long time educating people at that rank, rather as well as supporting. But I think you're right that Elizabeth might have a project that she can fund.
Yeah.
Well, one thing I want to say about that also is that I think that this is where the work of being an ally comes in, which we meant to talk about with the journal, because certainly that was, you know, part of the project as well, was if you are not one, you can be an ally to one. And if you have a person who needs that mentorship or who would benefit from it, you can be an ally. And I think that's important work that doesn't get recognized. And that was something that we cared a lot about in the founding of Meridians also.
Now, I want to point out also, because it's in your bios, but again, I'll say it now for the audience, that Nancy and Susan both did important institution building work at Smith that also shifted the needle in establishing Latin American and Latino studies in Nancy's case, and women's studies in Susan's case. That you both produced new programs and departments here that were precisely about making visible the importance of that work as intellectual fields, right? Fields that were scholarly and that were producing cutting edge knowledge and offering undergraduate students, but also, folks like me. And I often say that I believe that I would never have been hired at Smith were it not for Ruth's vision, for Nancy's creating Latin American Latino studies, and for the home that women's studies gave me here. And it was those two places were my home. I was a sociologist. My appointment is in sociology. I adore my sociology colleagues. But really, really where I was at home, where I felt la bienvenida that I need as a Latina first-generation faculty member, was in those two units and in the community that you brought to campus repeatedly with Meridians. And I just, we mentioned a couple of the folks, but I feel compelled to call their names again and really explicitly put on the record who was on the founding advisory board, because it is such a luminary list of people. We knew they were amazing then. I think 20 years on, we know even more fully how amazing they are and have been. So I'm going to name them. Edna Acosta Belén, SUNY Albany. Leila Ahmed, Harvard University. Ama Ata Ayu, Accra, Ghana. Amrita Bashu, Amherst College. Ray Chow, Brown University. Maurice Condé, Columbia University. Angela Davis, UC Santa Cruz. I have the great privilege of moderating a conversation with her tomorrow, by the way. The fangirl moment of my life. But I'll move on. Cynthia Enlow, Clark University. Paula Giddings, Duke University and Smith College. Wilma Mankiller, Stillwell, Oklahoma. Toni Morrison, Princeton University. Nell Irving Painter, Princeton University. Elena Poniatowska, Chimalista, Mexico. Nawal Al-Sadali, Cairo, Egypt. Vandana Shiva, New Delhi, India. The hair on my arm is standing up. We've lost so many of these amazing women, but they are here. They are here with us. They have inspired Meridians. They inspire Meridians Project. They inspire Meridians readers. They inspire Meridians activists. They inspire all of us. And I'm so grateful to be part of that legacy. I want to also name, if I may, the editorial board that you put together, in addition to putting together that amazing founding advisory board. And I'd like you to say a little bit about how you managed to convince these women to come and take a chance on this new project, right, in the late 1990s. But let me name the editorial board as well. Sonia Alvarez, at the time from the University of California, Santa Cruz, now at UMass Amherst. Peggy Antrobus, Barbados, West Indies. Katie Cannon, Temple University. Chungmu Choi, University of California, Irvine. Joan Diane, University of Arizona. Anne Ducille, Wesleyan University. Inderpal Grewal, San Francisco State University. Farah Griffin, University of Pennsylvania. Maria Elena Sobek, University of California, Santa Barbara. Kelly Jones, Yale University. Deborah King, Dartmouth University. Josephine Lee, University of Minnesota. Karen McCarthy Brown, Drew University. Ranu Samantrai, Claremont Graduate University. Sasha Torres, Johns Hopkins University. Kamala Misbarian, University of Texas, Austin. How did you do it? How did you do it? How did you approach these women, tell them about Meridians, and get them to come on board?
I think they understood the project. I think they knew, as Nancy said, the area was vast and deeply, deeply important. And so I think they saw it as an opportunity to have this collective force by advising us and serving on the editorial board. I want to say these people worked. They didn't just collect a stipend. There were no stipends to be had. They worked. And what they did was write our readers' reports. And those were so thorough, so helpful. You know, sometimes you get reviewed by a journal and they just say, no, there's nothing to be gained by telling you anything that you could do to improve. But these people wrote fantastic readers' reports. And all of our reviewers did. So I think that they saw the merit in the project and they wanted to be a part of it. I mean, it did astonish us too, didn't it, Nancy? But we both, all of us, the collective, just reread our introduction, and we wrote to each other and said, "That was brilliant."
Well, the other thing was that we each reached out to women we knew to ask them, and I don't think a single person said no. I mean, that was really, and in fact, they said, "Oh, not only am I going to say yes, but I'm bringing along my friend." You know, that there was an effervescence, I want to say, about the whole idea of the project, and so that's how we got them to come.
Yeah. And as you read through the names, I remember many of them had Smith roots, boyfriend of, girlfriend of somebody who was, but yeah, they or co-writer with people, and so they had Smith connections, and our friends had friends, and that's how that group assembled.
Yeah, thank you. So I want to pick up also on Bashuli's question and point out that the question, Meridians is committed to mentoring. It is still part of the project, the mission, and the mandate. We take great care to carefully review our reviewers' reviews to make sure that they're helpful, critical, rigorous reviews rather than harmful. For the most part, they really are, because I have the great honor of saying that, last year, Meridians is part of the Council of Editors of Learned Journals, and there's a listserv. And last year, in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder and Breonna Taylor, and that just unending litany of police brutality and murder with impunity of Black people and people of color in the United States, the editors on that listserv, like many other collectives, began a conversation reflecting on what role their journals could take in addressing, first of all, recognizing, and secondly, addressing how historically white serving they had been in terms of their readership, in terms of what their content was, and in terms of their reviewers. And so there was this chatter and this back and forth about what is the demographics of your reviewer database? What percent? Are there any people of color among your reviewers? And I was watching this all go by and thinking, well, I don't have that problem. 99% of the reviewers in Meridians are women of color feminists. And, I felt kind of sorry for my colleagues in these other journals. And really, especially grateful for the work that our reviewers do in offering these rigorous, double-blind, truly peer reviews, right? That are still the gold standard of conventional scholarship in what are still historically white-serving institutions and the historically white pipeline for tenure, but are doing so from a place of true knowledge about the conversations, the debates, the terminology, the perspectives, the innovations that our authors are bringing, right, to the table, and often beginning with a position of mentoring as a goal, right, of offering real feedback that's going to help advance the work, whether or not it eventually gets published in Meridians, because we do have a page limit, right? Very often there are so many things we want to say yes to because it is meritorious and deserves a space, but there's a certain number of pages and we have to abide by that. So we'll suggest then other editors, other journals where their work might find an equally amenable home, we hope. So that work of mentoring and growing the pipeline, the women of color, feminist, scholarly, knowledge-producing pipeline, right, is still very much a part of Meridian's mission. And it was a role model that was established in those early years and sustained throughout my previous service on the editorial advisory board. So thank you for really modeling that and teaching me how to carry it forward, as did my predecessors, who I look forward to joining on Saturday. Okay, I want to ask if there's any more questions from our audience, so that before we wrap for the evening, if Ruth or Susan or Nancy have final comments for us before we send everybody home and invite them to join us tomorrow at 10 a.m. Can I ask for some parting thoughts?
Yes, I thank you for investigating our history, giving us this founders panel moment. So important to us. It's so easy for histories to become lost. And so creating this as the opening session was really, really important to us. Very, very meaningful. Thank you, Ginetta.
Thank you, Susan, for making the time. I really appreciate
Yeah, I
it.
echo what Susan said. Thank you very much. And just to remember it is great.
Thank you again, Nancy.
Ditto.
Happy 20th.
Thank you. Thank you all so much. Your words are inspiring. Your role model is inspiring. And we are all ever so grateful. So thank you again. Thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight. I remind you that we open tomorrow at 10 a.m. You have to register for each day individually, so make sure that you're not just registered for today, but that you've also registered for tomorrow. Check out our bookshop. Go buy a copy of our 20th anniversary reader. Use it in your classes. Teach it in Introduction to Women's Studies. And send us your work. Thank you. Good night and buenas noches.
Buenas noches.